Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I now see with Representative Peake coming through the door enough to make a quorum, and we appreciate that. It is late in the day already, so I thought we'd get started as near on time as we possibly could. We have only one bill on our agenda today, but it is a very, very important proposition for the people of the state of Georgia. And if we could, is there anybody on the committee that has anything to say before we begin? Well, I call this meeting of the full committee Ways and Means to order, and would recognize the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Rogers, to tell us about Senate Bill 346. Please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That title of representative or senator, I can go either way on that.
You've been there.
Or either way. And I want to thank the members of the committee for being with us today. I hope that you'll still like me after we get done with this. This is a little bit of a lengthy bill, but I will tell you it started at 49 pages and we're down to 40. So we are moving in the right direction. And I just will make a couple of opening comments, and then there's a number of people who want to talk about the bill or the issue, and then I'll come back and run through this section by section. I would be remiss if I didn't start off by thanking the chairman and his staff, particularly Lindsay, and the incredible work they've done to help us get to this point. We would not be here today without her help specifically. Last year, I worked on a proposition, I think it was Senate Bill 240, that came from an idea raised by Representative Levitas here in the House, and that got put into law. During that process, we began to hear all sorts of stories about problems with the property tax system. So I chaired a committee over the summer and into the fall that looked at the assessment and appeals process. And I will tell you, I was absolutely floored by the response we got out of that. The stories that came out about how problematic our current system is led you to only one conclusion, and that is we needed a major overhaul because the assessment and appeals process in Georgia simply does not work. This is our attempt at an overhaul. I'm not going to sit here today and tell you it's perfect or that this is going to solve all the problems, but I believe as you hear when we go through this, that this is a dramatic improvement over what we have today. And it really centers around two things. Number one is that taxpayers ought to have the expectation that their assessment is as close to fair market value as possible. And number two, if it's not, there ought to be an easy process weighted in favor of the taxpayer to get it corrected. And that's really the two central themes that this bill encapsulates. What I would like to do, again, is allow some, at the chairman's approval, allow some of the people who have been involved in this process from day one to come up and talk about why we need this, why this bill is important, and then I'll gladly go through it step by step and answer any questions. I want to join with the chairman in saying our hope is to be out of here by 5 o'clock and no later, because I know we're going to take this bill up again at another time. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, should I read these names or should I just give you the list?
I'll tell you what, you're recognized to just recognize whoever you want to yield to and tell us a little bit about who they are, and maybe we ought to ask them to keep their comments to, say, 4 minutes or under, so whatever's reasonable. What do you think in that regard?
We will start with R.J. Morris. Once he speaks, you probably won't forget him. He wears many hats, and the one I think he's speaking with today is Georgia Property Taxpayers Committee.
Could Mr. Morris get you to come to either at the chair next to Senator Rogers or up at the podium, whichever you prefer?
All right, for those of you that do not know me, my name is R.J. Morris. I'm a native Georgian. I've been in Atlanta since 1973, and I've been investing in real estate for the past 2 decades. Let's see. I'm also a proud member. As he said, I wear many hats. I'm a proud member and sponsor of the Fulton Taxpayers Foundation, and as of this week, I'm the founder and president of the Georgia Property Taxpayers Committee. This new committee shall be the people's advocate for reasonable property tax legislation, such as what you have before you today with Senate Bill 346. This bill will finally provide the much-needed relief so that many Georgians that are desperate for in this current great recession. I applaud both Senator Rogers and Representative Lindsay for their courageous efforts and hard work. I'm going to try to get to the points here because I'm going to stay under 4 minutes here. Basically, what we have is an antiquated and extremely unfair tax system that is based on a theory known as uniformity. Under this horrific system, when just a few neighbors move into a neighborhood and pay much more for their houses, the entire rest of the neighborhood has to try to figure out how to pay huge increases as well. All of this, even if their income did not go up one single penny. I ask each of you as representatives of the people, where are they supposed to come up with this money? Thus, those homeowners will be forced to do one of two things if they cannot pay those increases under the current law. First of all, they can sell their family home and move. Or secondly, don't worry about the homeowners that don't want to move. The local county government, or government in general, will be more than happy to send out the local sheriff to assist you. We know what that means. This is only one of the many problems. But let's be honest, the bottom line is no one really knows what a home is actually worth until that property is sold. Under the current system, it's simply a guess. And what happens after your home is sold? If you show the assessor he had you overassessed for years, does he give you all that overtaxed money back? Of course not. Just look at the sales taken from just a few here in the counties in Georgia. Here, the assessor had this one very underassessed at $33,000 in Gainesville. The property owner listed it for $142,000. That's what he thought it was worth. But it actually sold for $100,000. Nobody really knew what this house was worth. But Senator Rogers and Representative Lindsay have hit the nail on the head with how to solve this problem. Under this bill, once a home is sold in an arm's length transaction by a willing seller, and that's very important words here, there will be no question whatsoever as to its worth, and it will be assessed at that value. No questions. Once this bill does pass, hopefully we won't read any more of the horror stories like we read in the newspapers around our state, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And if you don't believe the newspaper study, over here is a map. I'm going to stand up a second so you can see this. This is John O'Callahan behind us. He's the president of the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. Don't want to take too much away from him, but they're a nonprofit that helps out lower-income families. Look at all of these homes below I-20 in low-income areas. 300 to 500% overassessed. In yellow, it's severely. In blue, it's highly.
I don't mean to cut you off, but you're already kind of right at about 10 seconds.
Sure. Let's see here. And this continues today. WSB-TV did a story about this year's assessments for 2010. The Fulton tax assessor admitted they cannot justify values for this year. Therefore, they decided to include a whole new category of illegal transactions. I'll close with this. There are no sales for over $30,000 or $40,000 for 2009 to justify 2010. So when we got our assessment showing this one house that we bought for $24,000, how is it possibly worth $95,000? Where do you have any sales that could possibly justify that? They said, well, we had this one for $122,000, $104,000. I couldn't understand how that was possible. Well, look at this. These are not actual sales. These are transfers from the owner where they were forced to relinquish their property back to the bank, and the bank can either record zero, or they can record the loan amount, or whatever they want to. No money ever exchanges hands. But the tax assessor is saying that's going to be the valid sale, even though if you look at these loan amounts for $122,000 that they're saying is the justifiable one, and the same year, just a few months later, instead of $122,000, it's sold for $22,000. The loan value on this one, $104,000 that they say is the actual fair market value, it's sold for $58,000. This is incredulous. This is still going on now for 2010. Okay. All right. conclusion, the bottom line is this is a great bill. This will do not any of the opposition. If they are ethical and honest, there will be no opposition to this bill. The only people that are going to have problems with it are the unethical tax assessors. Thank you all very much.
As I said, you probably won't forget them. Following on this theme, Mr. John O'Callahan. And Mr. O'Callahan, again, as was referenced, and he can certainly speak to this, works with low-income families and helps with housing and does all sorts of research. And he was really the one who was, if you haven't seen his reports on the disparities between real value and assessed value in Metro Atlanta, it's really shocking at how much some people are being overtaxed. And unfortunately, it's the people who can least afford to pay those taxes.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, committee. I'm delighted that Georgia is actually dealing with this issue. We work with other nonprofits across the country, and this is a standard problem in areas across the country, big cities, rural areas. And Georgia's really taking the leadership, both in the bill that was passed last year that included foreclosure as one of the things you look at when a property sells from a willing buyer to a willing seller. This year's legislation is so critical. None of us would want anyone to have to overpay their taxes. The tax assessors have a job to set what is a fair basis of taxation, and their job is to get it right. We do know at the time of a sale, if it's between a willing buyer and a willing seller, that's what a property is worth. We went and looked at sales through a realtor in an open market and compared those to what assessors had values coming out of last year. And what we found was dramatic overpayments really across. We studied Metro Atlanta. Anecdotally, we understand this to be true across the state. But the greatest impact was born in communities that had the highest rate of foreclosure, what you may expect. These were communities that had fraudulent sales. In many instances, the values that the assessors had on the books were really higher than the market ever was worth, and now the market has fallen. And what we found is that if you live in many of these neighborhoods that are predominantly low income, very high foreclosure, and predominantly minority communities, that you risk overpaying your taxes in some communities up to $1,300 a year. That's $100 a month. We need to keep people in their homes, and there are homeowners that are hanging on where that $100 a month may be the difference between another foreclosure occurring. We have new people wanting to move into the neighborhoods that are qualified for a mortgage loan, yet they can't get it because they may be off on their ratios because of that extra $100 in taxes. Irregardless of those facts, we just want to make sure that people are treated right. I think particularly when you see lower income folks who are working and have found the dream of home ownership and they're doing the right thing by their communities and their families, you want to make sure that those folks are treated right particularly. This bill not only requires a new process, but it makes it very simple. What we found is it's hard to contest your taxes. It's hard to file that property tax return. Each county has it different. Everybody has different steps. Some counties you have to phone. Some you have to go see them. Some you have to write them. And as we advise low-income neighborhoods, they need a simple process that they can access. If you're upper income, you can hire someone to go and contest your taxes for you. If you're lower income, you count on the government to get it right. If a high-income person was the one most impacted, we'd want fairness, but we need fairness across the board. This bill makes it simple. It really puts Georgia in a leadership position. And I think what it will do is increase values in these neighborhoods. What we're going to see is these neighborhoods start to stabilize when we get the taxes right. And so we're all concerned about local government revenues. I'm a former local government elected official. But those neighborhoods have to stabilize so that values can return. And in getting this right, I think we are going to do well by all Georgians, but particularly those neighborhoods most at risk of foreclosure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Callahan. Due to the amount of time we have left, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go ahead and delve right into the bill. A couple of the other people that signed up, Mr. Wheeler Bryan and Roger Land, are both attorneys who have been with us during this entire process, even back to last year, and we can certainly ask them any technical questions. And my very good friend Clint Mueller with ACCG, and I'm sure he'll be able to answer questions as well. And, but if it's okay, I'm just going to go ahead and delve into the bill since it is 40 pages long.
Please continue.
Okay, obviously page 1 is simply the title and the description. If you'll join me on page 2. This is, if not the most important part of the bill, one of the most important parts of the bill, and it changes something that has needed to be changed for quite some time. This requires an annual notice of current assessment. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, because you probably all know exactly how the property tax system works. But for those who don't, it's really important to note why this is such an important thing for us to do. Right now, if you do not file a return of real property and you do not receive a notice of assessment, you have no right to appeal. So very few people in the state even know about the process of returning a property return. If you do that, it actually triggers notice of assessment, but almost no one knows that even exists. So let's say that 2 years ago your house was worth $350,000, and this year all your neighbors are selling similar houses for $250,000. Well, logically that means your house is probably worth $250,000. If you do not receive a notice of assessment, and then you get your tax bill, and you want to appeal your tax bill, and you call the office and say, I'd like to appeal this, they'll say, you have no right to appeal, because you only have a right to appeal if you receive this notice of assessment. So that's why this is so important for having the notice, every property owner in Georgia receiving a notice of assessment every year. Now, my home county has had this in place for many years, and it works very well in Cherokee County. We have our tax assessor here, and he'd be happy to speak to that, I'm sure. But every property owner in Cherokee County receives a notice of assessment every year, and the system works. So we're not just trying something that we think will work. We know that this in fact does work. One of the issues about this is cost. Hopefully, we're going to move to a point where almost all of these type things are done electronically. If you look on lines 56 through 58, we started that process by saying, if the taxpayer wants to receive these notices electronically, they may do so at their election, and we think that's a great way to get the information you need while saving all the other taxpayers' money. On page number 3, with lines 67 through 69, this just simply says that this notice of assessment, that it needs to be uniform across the state. We think that's, again, a small step, but a positive step. Lines 81 through 82 says that when these notices go out, if the county has a website address, it needs to be posted on there so the taxpayer can find it. There also needs to be posted a statement saying that the documents and records used to determine that value are available upon request. We heard amazing amounts of testimony from people who said, look, I'm fine with, my assessment, or I'm not fine with my assessment, but the one thing I would like to know is how they came up with this. And so we need to let taxpayers know that they do have access and should have access to the information that determined their assessment. There was talk at the very beginning of this process of going to year-round appeals. Now, I thought year-round appeals would work. I still think they'll work. But I backed off of that in exchange for what you see here on lines 86 and 87. And that is, in the real world, when people get concerned about what their property tax is when they open up the bill and they see how much they owe. For most people, when they see the notice of assessment, if they actually receive a notice of assessment, they look at the amount, but it says on there, this is not a bill, so most people just toss it in the trash. They don't worry about it. It's when they see that big dollar figure on there that's when they get concerned. What we're trying to do here is say, on the notice of assessment, we want to give the taxpayer an idea of how much their tax is going to be. Now, it's not going to be exact, but at least we want to give them an idea of what will be. Because if, in looking at that number, if they feel that they need to appeal their assessment, that will start the process. Lines 92 through 95, that just includes the additional options for filing an appeal. We'll get to those options later. On page 4, it is the estimate statement that will now have to be on all the assessments, and it just talks about what, based on the millage rate and the current year assessed value, how much they expect your tax will be. Now, we're not going to get it perfect because every jurisdiction has different eligible exemptions, and it will state on there that your bill could be higher or lower, but again, this is just an estimate. Lines 106 through 109 creates a date by which these notices must go out. Lines 114, that's again posting this information on the website if available. Again, lines 128 through 131, saying that the taxpayer may in fact request and receive the documents that were reviewed to create the assessment. Lines 137 all the way through 153 really get rid of an old process we had that dealt with whether the value was 15% more or less than what the returned value was. And since everyone's receiving a notice of assessment under this bill, that's not going to be necessary anymore. If you'll turn with me to page 6, at the bottom of page 6, sadly in some counties there are not boards of equalization that have currently been established. What this would do would allow two counties to come to an agreement that they could have a board of equalization that would serve both counties, and that board of equalization would rotate between the two counties, but wherever the property is being appealed, they would have to be in that county to hear the appeal. So from a taxpayer standpoint, it's not going to change. They're not going to have to drive to another county, but this does afford some counties who may not have a board of equalization that is in place right now to be able to afford to do so, which is absolutely necessary to handle appeals. On page 8, lines 266 through 272, simply a more concise rewrite of the oath that someone would have to take to serve on the Board of Equalization. Line 278 is that the chief judge will make the charge, but he or she could also have his or her designee do that. And typically, that we understand in normal practice, that is often done by the clerk of court, and we're going to be giving the clerk of court a lot more jurisdiction here. So we would think that that's exactly what would take place there, but the judge can decide that. One of the problems we heard about over and over again as we went through the study committee this year was that there doesn't seem to be anyone who oversees these boards of equalization. They seem to be an animal in and of themselves, and that there's no one really to report to or no one to oversee their actions. So after much negotiation, we have worked with the clerks of the Superior, or the clerks of court, and lines 300 all the way to 340 is simply allowing and putting in place the process by which the clerks would oversee the boards of equalization. And again, as I go through this, I don't know of opposition to any of this. If there is opposition to it, you'll probably hear it. But as of now, as of the last meeting I had, I think we had most everything ironed out. At the bottom of page 10, one of the things we found out is that you may have, as you know, the assessment is based on the January 1st value and the property owner at the time of January 1st. What may happen, though, is prior to appeal, that property may change hands. And one of the problems that we see in the state is that the new owner didn't have a right to appeal, even though they own the property and they were going to be responsible for paying the tax. So this just simply says that the new property owner can file the appeal as well, which is only right since they're the person that's going to have to pay that tax. If you move over to lines 367, this is where the clerk could grant additional extensions to taxpayers or the County Board of Tax Assessors for good cause shown. Under current law right now, you get one chance. If you have to reschedule a hearing, that's it. You get one chance. But if something comes up the next time, I mean, you could have a death in the family, and they're not allowed to reschedule. This just simply says if you show good cause, they can reschedule. 369 through 372 says that the commissioner shall adopt the procedures and standards for these boards of equalization, the hearing officers and their arbitrators, and these rules actually have to be updated at least every 5 years. That's one of the problems that we had, is that so many people said that it's not proper training, it's not uniform across the state, and that the regulations haven't been updated in forever. So this just says at least once every 5 years the Department of Revenue has to update these regulations and make them uniform across the state. You will find throughout this bill in many places where we have added emailing if the county is okay with accepting these type of transactions via email, and you'll find that on page 373 and 374. Another problem that came out of our committee is that sometimes the taxpayer and the tax assessors can actually come to an agreement, yet the law says they have to take further steps beyond that even when they come to an agreement. And we thought that was just really a waste of time for the government, waste of time for the taxpayers. If they come to an agreement, that would a signed agreement that would terminate the appeal and it would be over. We have right now a 21-day rule that we're extending to 30 days if the taxpayer is unhappy with their assessment and the Board of Assessors says, all right, we're going to change it, and maybe the taxpayer says it should be $100,000 less, and the Board of Assessors says, all right, we're willing to change it, but we're only going to change it $5,000. The taxpayer then has 21 days in which to respond to that. This would extend that to 30 days, giving them an opportunity to respond to that. And again, this can be done on lines 408 and 409 via email. The lines here on page 13 are, we're taking out some things that we'll address later, but one of them, for example, 434 through 436, deals with the uniform procedures that we talked about earlier. Lines 455 and 456, again, another problem we heard from a lot of property owners was, we go before the Board of Equalization and we don't get a decision. This just simply says that they have to render their decision at the end of that hearing. On lines 502, again, current law says the county governing authority, we're changing that to the clerk of superior court for overseeing those boards of equalization. Again, between lines 511 and 518, if the taxpayer and the assessors can come to an agreement, doesn't need to go before the Board of Equalization, they can just call that appeal final. Lines 519 all the way through 586 is something new, and I want to spend just a minute on this because this is very important. As we went through this process, so many people said over and over again, look, these boards of equalization are really not the way that we need to do this. This is a problem. So we began to look at what other states do, and I spent some time talking with the people in Tennessee to see how they do it. And what they do is they have, instead of boards of equalization, they have what's known as a hearing officer. And for residential property, they have a real estate broker as their hearing officer. And for commercial property, they use a licensed commercial appraiser for their hearing officer. We didn't feel like we wanted to go that full step. But what we did want to do is begin to put this process in place for non-homesteaded properties valued at $1 million or more. So basically what we're talking about are income-producing properties. And we wanted to copy pretty much what Tennessee had done. And one of the reasons we wanted to do what Tennessee had done is because theirs has been extremely successful. In fact, when we talked to the people in Tennessee, they said using this process, about 90 or over 90% of the problems get handled, and it's done in a very quick manner. The taxpayer seems to be happy, the county is happy, and they move forward, and these things don't end up going to court. So anything we can do to prevent property tax cases from having to go to court is a good thing for the state of Georgia, because that is an enormous waste of time and waste of money for everybody. So what this would do is would establish the creation of this hearing officer for these non-homesteaded properties that are valued at $1 million or more. At the bottom of page 15, lines 522 and 523, this just simply says how you would go about filing that appeal, that you would want to use the hearing officer. And this is at the election of the taxpayer. This is the taxpayer's decision to use this hearing officer if he or she wishes to do so. The Board of Tax Assessors would then have 90 days to review the appeal and again, make corrections if they wanted. If those corrections are made, the taxpayer then has 30 days to review those corrections. You'll see that on line 532. And they can either agree or not agree. And if they don't agree, then they're going to go to the hearing officer. The clerk of superior court on line 537 would randomly select that hearing officer from people that have expertise in appraising the type of property that is the subject of appeal. Now, I want to go back just for 1 second. The reason we chose the hearing officer for these type properties is boards of equalization have their challenges in that, they're just regular citizens like we are, and they may not have any experience whatsoever in the world of real estate or even property taxes, but they sit and listen to these cases. That may work for a standard residential property, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house that's valued at $200,000. Oftentimes it doesn't work for large commercial buildings, for unique houses, or for properties well in excess of $1 million. And that's why we think the hearing officer will be a better way to handle this, because again, we're talking about someone who has expertise in hearing or appraising the type of property that is subject to the appeal. So we're taking experts in these fields to look at these properties and make the right decision. The hearing officer will swear in the witnesses just as you would do before, just as they would do in any type of hearing like this. They will look at the fair market value and uniformity. That is what they're looking at, fair market value and uniformity. The taxpayer or the Board of Tax Assessors may still appeal this decision to the Superior Court, which is the current right they have to do today. Lines 552 through 559 allow these, or it sets up the requirement for who can serve as a hearing officer. At the top of page 17, the clerk gives the office and the facilities. Again, 562 through 568, if the taxpayer and the assessors can come to an agreement, they should certainly be allowed to do so. We would pay the county would determine what the compensation would be, but it would not be less than $25 per hour. There has to be training, if you look at lines 573 through 579. And the commissioner will, of course, create the rules and regulations for the administration of this section. So that is the creation of the hearing officer. Bottom of line 17, again, appeals to the Superior Court. If you're under appeal, you're going to Superior Court, you come to an agreement, you can, by mutual written agreement, stop the process and call it quits. Lines 604 through 606, again, that allows email. If we move, there's nothing, we're just, on the next couple of pages, we're just taking out the words arbitrator or arbitrators and replacing with hearing officer. That goes all the way to line 710, and this deals with service of notice. There are so many ways to serve notice other than simply sending a piece of first-class mail. And this, of course, allows you to do so via email if the county allows that to happen. It also allows you to do it via overnight delivery, and that those would be valid notices. Part 3, Section 3.1, this just simply creates a uniform date for filing any returns. Now, on real property, which of course is your land and your house, no one will really need to file a return. You're still allowed to. We're not taking that away, but you wouldn't need to because you're going to receive your notice of assessment. On personal property, your boat, your car, whatever, you may want to still file a return, and this just simply sets that date on April 1st. I think there were just a handful of counties that had it at March 1st. This would be uniform across the state on April 1st. I'll speed through this next part. Section 4.1 on page 22, we're defining what a local tax official means. This helps. What we heard time and time again was that people weren't properly trained. This is getting the commissioner to administer these courses for proper training, and that this training would be made available online. One of the problems the state has is that the only training sometimes seems to be in Athens or somewhere else where everybody has to drive to it. We're saying this training needs to be made available online so people don't have to waste taxpayer money and drive to some location to receive the training. And that these courses would be open and available to the public if you're willing to pay a fee for the course that's being provided. Sometimes it's very important that taxpayers know how the tax laws are going to be carried out, and if they're available, if they would like to go to some of these courses, they should be allowed to go to these courses. 778 through 780, it simply says the commissioner is authorized to work with any organization or other professionals with expertise in providing instruction in property tax administration. Lines on page 23, lines 789 through 793, it just says that you're going to have a high school diploma to serve on a county board of tax assessors. Line 25 is extremely important. I'm sorry, page 25, line 840 is extremely important. We have been wrestling for the last few years to determine what is a bona fide sale. And this is really at the heart of much of what is being you see up here, and that is assessors across the state will determine that a foreclosure property or a short sale or a bank sale may not be a bona fide sale to be included with all the other sales to determine value. So one of the problems we've had over the last couple of years with declining values is determining what is a bona fide sale. And we have been around and around and around on this, and I think this is as close to as good as we can get it, and I think it's a pretty legitimate definition. It means a transaction which has occurred in good faith and without fraud or deceit, carried out by unrelated or unaffiliated parties, as by a willing buyer and a willing seller, each acting in his or her own self-interest, including but not limited to distress sales, short sales, bank sales, or sales at public auction. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, unaffiliated parties. That is crucial to what this document shows here, because when a bank takes back its own property, that is an affiliated party. That's not an unaffiliated party. So that would not, a bank taking back the property that they have the note on would not be an arm's length bona fide sale. So you could not include that as a transaction for the purposes of determining assessed value. We're talking about unaffiliated parties here where there's a willing buyer and a willing seller creating an arm's length bona fide sale. Right below that, lines 850 through 853, we're adding to what is the current definition of fair market value. And we say the income approach, if data is available, shall be considered in determining the fair market value of income-producing property. So in other words, if I have a building that 3 years ago was 100% occupied, and today it's 25% occupied, the value of that building is not the same any longer. The building may be the same, the land may be the same, but the value is no longer the same because you've got to take into consideration how much income that property is producing. In other words, if you're think about it from this perspective, if I'm a buyer and I want to go buy a high-rise in Atlanta and I got two exact buildings sitting next to each other, one is 100% occupied, if lots of rent money coming in, the other one's 25% occupied, which building's worth more? Clearly the one that's fully rented. So you have to take into consideration the income amount. And then lines 851 through 853 is extremely important from this problem that was identified here and it exists all across the state, and that is, what is the value of a property? Well, the value of a property is what a willing buyer, willing seller is willing to agree upon. So what this says is that when a transaction occurs and an arm's length bona fide sale, that is the maximum allowable value for that property the next time the tax bill comes out. And what that does, that creates certainty for the person who bought the property, because when I go to buy a property, I'm not just looking at how much it cost me to buy the property and what my monthly payment will be, but I also need to know how much I'm going to owe in taxes. And if I know the tax is going to be based on what I just paid for it, then I got some certainty. So the next time the tax bill comes out, it should be, as a maximum, the value that you paid for the property. Line 869 deals with the problem that we heard stories that sometimes a property was being valued for something that it wasn't. It was being valued for something that it could be. And this just simply says that the value of the property ought to be what it is, not what somebody envisions it may be in the future. So this would prohibit the use of future use as determining the value of the property. Under the arbitration section on lines 883 through 886, it just says, it defines, of course, what a certified appraisal is. And we are getting rid of, just so you know, getting rid of the non-binding arbitration process in Georgia. And that's what you see, everything that is scratched out here or crossed through all the way through line 929. We talked to our assessors, and I believe both of them are here, from Cobb County and Cherokee County, who obviously handle lots of properties, lots of assessments, and asked them, has this ever been used? And I don't want to speak for them, but if I recall the conversation we had, maybe once or twice in a period of years this has ever been used. We have in its place, of course, now the binding arbitration process that was put into law last year, which we think works considerably better. Speaking of that binding arbitration process, if you will look at lines 938 through 940, this deals with the arbitration process and says within 10 days of receiving that notice, they're going to have to, the Board of Tax Assessors shall acknowledge the receipt. It gives them 45 days. The taxpayer has 45 days to provide that certified appraisal. And what this process, if you recall, does is it simply says the taxpayer can go out, get their own appraisal, take it to the assessors and say, look, here's a certified appraisal on how much this property is worth. Will you accept this? If they accept it, fine, that's the end of the story. If they don't accept it, then it simply goes to an arbitrator, and this is binding arbitration, and the arbitrator has to decide which is right. It's baseball arbitration for anybody that's familiar with that. They can't cut it down the middle. And what that does is that forces both sides to be very honest. Forces both sides to come to the table with a realistic value. The taxpayer will have the certified appraisal. The assessors comes to the table. The arbitrator chooses one or the other. And that is very key, that they actually have to choose one or the other. One of the things we ran into, and I'll be very quick to finish out the last few pages here, one of the things we ran into last year is there's one county we know of, one major metro Atlanta county, and it's somewhat shameful that this occurred, but when Senate Bill 240 passed last year and became the law, taxpayers would spend their own money, go out and get a certified appraisal as they were required to do, turn that appraisal in, and the county would do nothing. They wouldn't accept it or reject it. Well, we didn't put anything in the law to say what happens if they neither accept it or reject it. So the taxpayer went out and spent the money trying to make a legitimate appeal based on the law, and now they get nothing. They just get ignored, which is absolutely wrong. So this says that if they don't accept it or reject it within 45 days, the appraisal stands as the value. So that'll get them off the case. It also says that if this happened in 2009, which is the only year, that value is going to stand. So if you just ignored the taxpayer and said, we're not even going to take up your case, then the taxpayer's value under the certified appraisal would stand. Again, if you look on page 29, lines 980 through 983, we're talking about who can serve as an arbitrator. We want to make sure that the arbitrators are professionals in these areas that know what they're doing. On line 1002, you will find that the arbitrator shall render the decision at the conclusion of the hearing, not within 30 days. Line 1013 says that if the taxpayer's value is determined to be the value, that the county shall be responsible for paying the clerk of the Superior Court's fees, if any. And that if the tax assessors win, then the taxpayer has to pay those fees. Then lines 1020 through 1021 just simply say that how that can be appealed. Line 1036 through 39, this deals with, if you recall, we passed House Bill 233 last year that set the two-year moratorium on assessments going up. What happened under this is, of course, there are rules and regulations by which the Department of Revenue can fine counties based on a parcel, on a per parcel basis, if they're not in line with some of those regulations. And since the General Assembly passed House Bill 233 telling them they couldn't raise assessments, they need to be relinquished from that responsibility to pay those fines. So I think that's the proper thing to do for the local governments. If you look at lines 1101 all the way to 1119, this deals with how you handle the interim tax bill. One of the problems we had, I believe, in one small county, there were rules for a percentage of property that was still out on appeal, and that the taxpayer or that the county couldn't send out the bills to everybody else if a certain percentage of the property was out on appeal. This deals with that and allows them to go ahead and send out those bills. This also deals with in the event that the Commissioner has not provided the tax assessors by August 1st the notice of proposed assessments. For the taxpayers who are required to return their property to the Commissioner. So this deals with that 85% payment. Line 1157 allows the local governing body to, and this takes us all the way down to line 1173. Right now under Georgia law, if you want to pay your property tax, you can pay it one time or you can pay 2 installments. This would allow the local governments to work with the taxpayer and work out a payment plan that goes beyond just the 2 installments. And line 1197 just says they have to do that by ordinance or resolution. Lines 1204 and 1205 says that the governing authority of the local government can determine what type of payment they want to take. We want to give them as much flexibility as possible to accept those payments. Lines 1239 through 1242, I believe this is just cleanup language that our excellent legislative counsel had thought we needed dealing with current law on the rollback rates. Line 1258 talks about general maintenance and operation millage rates, and that those on lines 1264 and 1265 could be they could post those advertisements on the website, which I think is a good thing. Lines 1267 all the way through 1281 deal with on how they would post those notices, and this goes back to the property owner's Bill of Rights on posting notices of property tax increases if the millage rate's not completely rolled back. Lines 1285 deal with how large those advertisements need to be and about posting them on the website. Line 1303 talks about the Commissioner not accepting a digest for review or issuing an order authorizing the collection of taxes if the recommending authority or levying authority other than the municipal governing authorities has established a millage rate in excess of the correct rollback rate if they have not complied with the notices. So in other words, if you haven't rolled it back as you're supposed to and put out the notices, he or she is not going to accept that digest for review. All right, then finally, lines 1340 through 1343 says that the tax assessors shall correct an error, a factual error that has been found within 3 years if that error is to the benefit of the taxpayer. Mr. Chairman, I know that was lengthy and somewhat tedious, but that takes us all the way through page 40. With 2 minutes to spare.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. And I think in deference to I know you have another meeting to attend at 5 o'clock, and I know we have several questions from members of the committee. That may be the first order of business tomorrow as we reconvene. We are going to reconvene at 11 tomorrow. We originally were scheduled for 10, but that interferes with our appropriations committee meeting, so we've been asked to wait till 11. And if there's no further business come before the committee today, we will stand adjourned until then, and we thank the Majority Leader for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.